Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi, and with everything that we know is going on with the COVID-19 pandemic and the cancellation of a lot of things in sports, college football is still one of those things that is up in the air and is being heavily discussed. But for right now, things are still planning to go on as scheduled. So in this episode, we're going to take a look ahead at what we should be expecting to see this fall or whenever college football gets kicked off from each of the conferences. And in this first segment, we're going to start off by talking about the SEC. And the SEC is a storied conference. Obviously, it's one that's in the spotlight quite a bit, and it was probably by far the best conference in college football last year. And that's with half of the league still not being on the radar. That's how good the SEC, the top half of the SEC is. LSU, Georgia, Florida, Texas A&M, even Kentucky and Tennessee, they all won their bowl games last year. Auburn came up with one of the biggest keys to the season with their opening win over Oregon in week 1. But the top half is truly carrying a whole lot of dead weight at the bottom half, such as Arkansas, who had a miserable season last year, really not one to speak about. South Carolina had a disappointing season as well. Vanderbilt and Ole Miss both are not teams that you're really going to get excited about. They had disasters of a season, and Missouri would have gone to a bowl game if, NCAA rules were a little bit differently and worked a little more in their favor. But that's one of the fallbacks of having such a top-heavy conference. Even a team that's just a little bit middling or may have a chance to be on the edge kind of gets knocked off that edge because there are so many really strong teams ahead of them. And Mississippi State, they at least got an extra game, but overall, things weren't really that great for any of the teams that you can mention outside of the superstars of the SEC conference. So 5 out of the top 14 teams in both of the final polls were from the SEC, but 5 out of the top 15 were from the Big Ten. The difference between those two is that 4 of those top 8 teams, LSU, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, were SEC. And one of those was a dominant national champion. So that is what puts the SEC as probably a little more ahead of the Big Ten in terms of who is more of a heavyweight conference. Because in a lot of ways, they are neck and neck with the way that they are constantly in the spotlight, have a lot of heavyweight teams, dominate recruiting, dominate TV deals, but also have a bottom half of their conference that needs to be carried a little bit and doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention. But even with all of that being said, LSU is still expected to take a little bit of a step back this season whenever they do get started, because they are missing a bunch of parts from their team, and those were parts that made them a national champion. So even though they do still have a system intact, and head coach Ed Orgeron obviously is still primed to take the lead into next year, it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period, and that's going to be expected. But a lot of people are anticipating a giant step back, and I'm not really sure if that's going to be the truth. Obviously, it remains to be seen. They may be a little bit of a shell of their former selves, but you can't knock them that much for that because they really had a once in a generation kind of season, and you can't really expect that kind of thing to be repeated. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be once in a generation. And the leaders of that team, obviously, are a lot of them are moving on. So even if they do have a good team next season and do reasonably get far, even if they don't make it into the college football playoff, a lot of people might consider that a failure compared to last season, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's would be considered a failure for LSU, especially given the fact that Alabama wasn't necessarily themselves last season either, and that really is what gave LSU a clear path to the spotlight that was the national championship game. And we shouldn't really expect Alabama to repeat what's considered for them a dud of a season in the midst of their dynastic run and dominance over college football. So it's reasonable to think that Alabama will go back to being Alabama. And then Florida, Georgia, and Auburn are still teams to contend with. And on any given Saturday, they'll be as good as any great team in America you could face. So if you pick them on the wrong day, you might have a chance, but those don't really come around often when you're dealing with teams in the SEC, at least in the top half of the SEC, as we've seen before. But the difference between this year and last should be the rise of the rest of that bottom half of the conference. And there have been a lot of coaching changes that have come around, like at Ole Miss, getting Lane Kiffin, and Mississippi State getting Mike Leach, although he has already gotten himself into a little bit of controversy even before the season has gone underway. And that should do wonders not only for the teams, but for their notoriety as well. And as far as teams like Arkansas go, be under any worse under their new head man, Sam Pittman. So if Leach and Kiffin can both work their magic right away and implement what they're known for, the west half of the SEC conference could really see a huge improvement and can end up being competitors that we haven't seen of them in a while. And they can end up doing some amazing things for the SEC on a national stage. So unlike in 2019, um, teams like South Carolina have a more manageable schedule, and they should be able to go from very mediocre to a middling 4-8 record to clinching a spot in a bowl game. And now that the bowl ban is lifted off of Mizzou, they are also another candidate to possibly go bowling. And it'll be really interesting to see just how many SEC teams end up playing extra games, um, depending on how many extra games that we end up getting this year, and depending on when the season starts, if it gets delayed at all. But for any of that to happen, there has to be a strong matchup against another Power 5 team in non-conference play, because a lot of times teams get criticized for their strength of schedule, and that's where you could point to the non-conference opponents. That's usually what makes the difference, especially when it comes to a stacked conference like the SEC. And especially with this conference, there's always a between them and other conferences because SEC has the reputation of not liking to travel, and they don't really get out of their comfort zones much, and you can understandably reason why that would annoy most of the other conferences, especially the Pac-12. But to play devil's advocate a little bit, they do play in neutral site games in side cities like Atlanta or Houston or even Arlington. But granted, those aren't really far from where SEC schools are located, even if they are out of state for some. And it's really not getting them out of their comfort southeastern zone. So you could definitely understand why people come at the SEC a little bit for the way their schedule is set up and the way it does favor not only them a little bit, but certain teams within the conference a little bit. But granted, they do still have to face heavy hitters constantly every season, like Alabama, Georgia, LSU, Florida, Auburn. You're always going to run into them at some point if you're a team within the SEC. So that's a little bit of a trade-off if you want to talk schedule. Now we're going to take our first break, but when we come back, we're going to head over to the Big Ten and talk about what's in store for them when the season starts.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first section, we went over the SEC conference and talked a little bit about what's in store for them whenever the season gets started. And now we're going to talk about another conference that is pretty much tied for the top conference in college football with the SEC, and that would be the Big Ten. And in the Big Ten, we all know that Ohio State is going to be Ohio State, and Penn State should be solid. Michigan usually is just fine, even if it's not good enough to really get into the postseason. But we are very sure in these heavy hitters at the top of the conference. But after that, it really becomes more of a question mark, just like how the SEC has teams that are at the bottom of the conference that really do need to be carried by the teams at the top. And when it comes to the Big Ten and those teams that could go either way, Michigan State might end up being more of a rebuild job than they might appear right off the bat, especially because now they're behind Mel Tucker and are going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage trying to get started and implement anything new into their system with the shutdowns of the normal practices that lead up to the season. Indiana might be okay, but they are still going to be Indiana, and there's not really anything that changes there that will lead you to expect that they might have a breakout season, even though anything is possible. And Rutgers is an interesting case because they're back under head coach Greg Schiano, but they're probably still going to need a little while to get going. And when it comes to Maryland, they're probably one of the biggest question marks of all because no one really has figured out what Maryland is going to look like next year. Wisconsin is another one of those teams that isn't struggling, is more likely to be one of the heavyweights in the Big Ten because of their great defense, their astounding defense last season, and their offense is pretty efficient even when it's not outstanding. But they have problems whenever they have to face another heavyweight, and that's where Wisconsin's question mark comes in. Even though they are a big name team and they definitely get national recognition and might even, depending on how well they play this season and how things pan out, be pushing for a playoff spot. But they might hit a weirdly brutal stretch in their schedule that might knock them off a little bit. And Well, to get to that in just a second, but as far as the rest of the West and the Big Ten goes, they'll probably be fine, but nothing amazing or anything to speak of, especially on a national stage. Um, all six of those teams um, should be good enough to get a bowl slot, depending on how expansive the bowl process is going to be this year. And that includes Illinois, Purdue, Northwestern, and probably Nebraska, as mediocre as those teams could probably be. But back to Wisconsin real quick, and that nasty stretch in their schedule they may hit. They're going to be facing Appalachian State, Michigan, Notre Dame, playing in Green Bay, and Minnesota before they get a week off. So that back to back to back to back challenging um, competition might throw them for a loop a little bit at some point in the season, especially depending on whether or not it gets delayed at all. But in general, their conference slate isn't too bad. Last year, the Badgers had to play Ohio State twice, and that definitely kind of threw them for a loop a little bit. But this year, they don't have to deal with the Buckeyes at all, unless they make it to the Big Ten championship, which, of course, anyone who makes it there knows they're going to have to go through Ohio State most likely. But they also don't have to face Michigan State or Penn State out of the East. So after that week off, they get Maryland, Illinois, Northwestern at Wrigley Field. Granted, this still goes as according to plan. At Purdue, and then home against Nebraska. So that's a relatively easy competition, especially given the teams of the Big Ten they could have been matched up against. Four of those teams that they play down the stretch didn't even make a bowl game, and they got Illinois on top of that. So that's before they finish up at Iowa, and that game should be manageable, especially if they take care of business the way they're expected to, and all of the 5 games leading up to the end of the season. And looking at Penn State, they're also breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief from not having to play the Badgers as well. And they'll take a little bit of a break off from that matchup. But they still have to go to Michigan, and they get Ohio State and Michigan State, luckily for them, at home in Happy Valley. But then they're on the road against Big Ten opponents like Indiana, Nebraska, and Rutgers. So those are about as favorable of matchups on the road as you can probably ask for, especially in this division. So head coach James Franklin and his team caught a little bit of a break with their schedule this year. Moving on to Purdue, they might have to deal with the trip to Michigan, but they also are fortunate enough to miss out on Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan State. But they do still have to take on Wisconsin and Iowa on their own turf, and that only leaves Indiana twice from October 3rd. Granted, the schedule goes as planned onwards. So that's a little bit of a favorable schedule for the top half, or the teams that are probably considered the top half of the Big Ten. And that really doesn't leave much wiggle room for the bottom half teams or teams that are in the middle. And they look like they kind of got screwed over by schedule makers a little bit. Iowa, Maryland, Rutgers, they really get the bad end of the stick by being the teams that the heavy hitters get extra time to prepare for. And we've heard this complaint from other teams before, like Notre Dame, Alabama, other national big names. They complain sometimes like, oh, they seem to see that teams that face them get a week off to rest up and get ready for them before they hit the field. And this year in the Big Ten, that quote-unquote honor, if you want to see it that way, falls on some of the teams that struggle the most within the Big Ten. Iowa, Maryland, and Rutgers happen to be the only 3 Big Ten teams that have to deal with more than one team that gets time off. Iowa has to deal with 2 rested teams, and they happen to be Penn State and Ohio State, and both games for them are on the road. So that doesn't seem like you planned that with Iowa in mind, to say the least. Rutgers gets 3 fresh teams during the Big Ten season. They're hosting Illinois and Nebraska, and then heading on the road to Purdue. which for Rutgers we know could be a bigger challenge than it sounds on paper. And on the downside, you would probably not use your week off to get ready to play Rutgers, but at this point, a break is a break, and that is if breaks are still factored into the schedule. But then you look at Maryland, and they're at Northwestern, Wisconsin, at Michigan, and at Indiana. And as if they didn't have enough issues already, they have to deal with 4 teams that get time off to figure out, how to stop the Terps schemes, which doesn't really seem like it's all that intricate to figure out. So it should be one of the more competitive seasons for a while in the Big Ten division. And all of it is basically to see who gets steamrolled in the end by the Buckeyes in the Big Ten championship on their way to what's probably yet another college football appearance. And now it's time for another break. But when we get back, we're going to head out west and take a look at what's ahead for the Pac-12.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first 2 segments before the break, we talked about the SEC and the Big Ten, the 2 heavy hitter conferences, and what is probably in store for them if and when the season gets underway. Now, for the third segment, we're going to head out west and take a look at the Pac-12, which doesn't really get a lot of attention as far as the national stage goes. It doesn't really get taken seriously all the time as a football conference. And you can definitely tell that a little bit by looking at the 2019 college football playoff picture, because it kind of looks like the playoff had a party and the Pac-12 was the only one that wasn't invited. Because it's not just about getting the conference champion in, which they didn't, because Oklahoma was picked over Oregon, even though throwing Oregon in there would have mixed it up a little bit and made it a little more interesting, probably. But it's also that the league can't get over that perception hump. And that's largely because the stars, or quote-unquote stars that are supposed to be leading the division, aren't shining brightly enough to be noticed all the time. And specifically in 2019, the same Oregon Ducks that were just mentioned, them losing to Auburn to start off the year had a little bit to do with that. And that kind of played into the narrative that the Pac-12 isn't a serious football conference and really isn't that good overall. And USC being a bit of a mixed bag and really mediocre since the last decade when they really had their dynastic run, really isn't helping the cause. The inability to turn around Arizona behind Kevin Sumlin is a thing too. And Chip Kelly really hasn't had the same magic since he left the division the first time, and he hasn't been able to summon up the same magic with UCLA. When it comes to Washington, they're a bit down in a rebuilding year themselves, so that doesn't seem to help the perception of the conference at all either. And Stanford wasn't really being noticed by the rest of America, but they did still have a very off year, and that is a pretty big deal when it comes to the Pac-12. So Oregon is going to be a top 10 team to start out the season, obviously, and they deserve to be there. And they might just have the right mix coming off of losing a quarterback like Justin Herbert to the draft, and already having his replacement in place. They might just have the system that it takes to not only be Pac-12 champions again, but possibly even sneak their way into the college football playoff. But with that being said, 8 out of the teams in the conference are going into this year with a new starting quarterback. And there isn't a sure thing rock star number 2 team behind Oregon that you can look at and automatically get fired up about. It's really going to come down to what we see on the field once players are safe and able to hit the field. But on the plus side, there also isn't a total free space game where you could pick an opponent and say that they're going to be beatable every single time. All 12 teams in the conference have something to like, which is really good for parity and proving the validity of the conference, because they're all evenly matched, even if they aren't all superstars. Anybody could win on any given Saturday. But the Pac-12 does need USC to be great again. It does need Washington and Stanford to be back to their usual form that we're used to seeing. And it wouldn't be the worst thing either if Utah could rebuild themselves in the matter of a few years also. But again, that is sort of the Pac-12's issue, the fact that they do need so much work still to be a legitimate, constantly good conference in general. But again, there should be more than enough good teams to make it interesting and entertaining this year to watch, if they're able to take the field. And there should be enough good teams to keep anyone, including Oregon, from just flying through the division and going 12-1 to get into the CFP. So just like in the Big Ten, it's also a big deal in the Big 12. It is in every conference when it comes to scheduling who has to play the rest of the teams. And it doesn't always work out that the team with 2 weeks to prepare comes out on top and comes out on fire and with all the energy. Obviously, that's not going to happen in every single case. But in general, you'd rather catch an opponent that's a little bit bruised up and exhausted than one that's had 2 weeks to recover from whatever ailed them in the last game. So in a perfect world, it would be fair if everybody in the conference had to play at least one conference game against the rest of the team, but that's not how this works, as we already know and have seen. And it gets a little extra quirky in the Pac-12 this year, so it's a little more interesting. And that starts off with Cal, who starts the season, as for now, planned for August 29th at UNLV. And they get time off before 2 of their opponents, Utah and Stanford. But on the flip side of that, they also have 2 games against rest of teams, with Oregon and Oregon State both getting 2 weeks each to get ready to face Cal. So it'll be a little interesting to see how Cal manages to handle all of those opponents at different ranks within the conference, coming in with fresh legs. For UCLA, they're the other conference team that starts in August, and they also get 2 open weeks. But only one of them is before a Pac-12 game, and that's against Utah. So given on what you think about non-conference play, especially when it comes to the Pac-12, you could say that either helps or hurts them. I think it might help them a little bit just to get a little extra time against a non-conference team if they still take that seriously. That might help them get a little bit of an edge up in their record, but maybe not in strength of schedule as far as their conference goes. For the Utes, Utah themselves, they get Cal and UCLA, and Colorado gets Arizona State and UCLA. And in that, they join Cal as the only others that have to deal with 2 rested Pac-12 teams. So that might give them an opportunity to prove themselves a little bit more. And then there's the other side of the coin. When you look at Stanford, their week off comes before they face Notre Dame. And it's one Pac-12 team that doesn't get rest before a conference battle. So Stanford if there's any season that they need to prove themselves, this would probably be the season, given the schedule stays the way it is once things get started. The rest of the teams in the conference all have one game against a rested Pac-12 team. Arizona has Colorado, Arizona State has Washington State, Oregon will take on Washington, Oregon State will face Arizona, and against Stanford will face Cal. But who gets the massive break by not facing anyone in conference play coming off of a break? There's only 3 teams that fall into that lucky category, and those are Washington, Washington State, and USC. And this matters so much because Pac-12 teams with 2 weeks off that had to prepare for other Pac-12 teams went 7-8 last year. That's fine, but Utah got 2 open days before games, and they won them both. Oregon got 2 open days before their games, and they won them both. So what did we see as a result? The 2 of those teams ended up playing in the Pac-12 championship. 2 other teams got open days before Pac-12 games, Washington and Washington State, and now both of them catch this break of not having to face anybody coming off of a break themselves, even though Washington lost both of those games last year. So hopefully they can make that work to their favor this season. And not saying it's a direct link for which teams are going to make the Pac-12 championship. That is a little bit of a fun reach to just think about. But it does go a lot to prove your credibility within the conference if you are able to pull off important wins like that. And especially in a season like this one, where it seems like every game is going to matter even more than it mattered before, that is nothing to take for granted. So when it comes down to it in the Pac-12, it looks like the schedule does matter, maybe here more than other conferences. And to cut to the chase, let's get down to who doesn't have to play Oregon. So strangely enough, they were not going to repeat last year's Pac-12 championship, even though we probably would have liked to see a rematch. And Utah is one of the teams that isn't on Oregon's schedule, and UCLA also doesn't have to deal with the Ducks. So those teams end up looking like the winners of this division as far as who's got the luckiest schedule. And the UCLA Bruins are probably the winners of all winners here because they missed both Washington and Oregon. On the flip side, Cal probably catches the worst of all the breaks in the conferences because they missed the only 2 teams that didn't get a bowl qualification last year in Arizona and Colorado. But ultimately, what it comes down to is what we see play out in front of us once action starts again on the field. And the Pac-12 is a story that is still being written by each team. And what we've seen is that it could be anybody's conference at any given time. That brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to head further south again and take a look at the Big 12 teams and see what's in store for them.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we talked about the Pac-12 and how the parity in that conference and between the schedule makes it a little more interesting when it comes to picking out who's going to come out of that conference and who will dominate. In this segment, we're going to head over to the Big 12, and the Big 12 is interesting, but in a different way than the Pac-12. And that isn't always necessarily a good thing because the Big 12 has had a few more struggles in their teams than maybe we've seen even in the Pac 12. Because even last year, 4 Big 12 teams didn't even win half of their games. And they didn't do that in 2018 as well. And 3 teams failed to win half of the games in 2017 on top of that. So that's not really a good showing out in recent years for the Big 12. But they did have Texas Tech, who managed to go bowling. And the league fattened up because Baylor and Kansas were 2 teams that rebounded after going 1-11 in previous seasons. And they both rose to take a little bit of a spotlight on a national stage as well. But that doesn't really cover up the point that the conference as a whole has been struggling for a long time, even dating back further than 2017. 5 teams finished with losing records in 2016. 4 teams ended up doing the same in 2015. So the point of that being is that their odds are overwhelming that most of the Big 12 is going to be mediocre to awful next season. No matter what happens, no matter when they kick off, whether they start play on time or not, about 40% it's predicted of the Big 12 is going to be forgettable to say the least. And going into the season, they should be okay as a whole because they do have some teams that stand out. Texas being one of them, obviously, and teams, again, that have rebounded like Kansas, who's going into year 2 under former LSU coach Les Miles, Oklahoma, obviously, and Baylor. But with just 10 teams in this league, if just 3 of them are down, that's a big chunk of the conference already, and that just drags everybody else down with them. So given that teams that have been mentioned already, like Oklahoma, Texas, they'll be outstanding. TCU and West Virginia could be the Baylor of last year and look like they might also take a little bit of a rise. At least 2 other teams could get bowl eligible and end up being a little bit dangerous. So the conference race should be a little bit fun, just within themselves, and there'll be a lot of tight finishes, most likely. But overall, there's not enough competitiveness between the 2 teams, beef or rivalries between the 2 teams, or just, enough at stake or on the line in a lot of games in order to make this too entertaining of a conference to watch this season, unfortunately saying. At least that's what it looks from the outset. But each team does have at least one non-conference game that should be big enough to be cared about. And starting with Baylor, they're going to face Ole Miss, even though Ole Miss hasn't looked that great in recent seasons. As was mentioned earlier in the episode, they are under a new head coach and staff, so that should be an interesting season opener in Houston for them. As far as Iowa State goes, their biggest competition is going to be Iowa, of course. It's the annual date. They play their in-state rival every year. There's nothing new there, and that is obviously going to be one that's entertaining to watch, no matter how good or bad both teams are. Kansas, they're going to take on Boston College, and they won at BC last year, so Kansas is looking good in that seat to control their own destiny, essentially, again this year. Kansas State is going to take on Vanderbilt, a team from the SEC, but not an overall threatening team from the SEC. But to their credit, they did go down to Mississippi State and win last season. So it's really Kansas State's game to lose. Oklahoma is going to get to face Tennessee, and it'll be one of the more fun non-conference showdowns this season. It's only the 5th time those 2 teams have met, and the Sooners won a thriller down in Knoxville back in 2015, and that helped them get to the CFP in that year. So it'll be really fun to watch the Sooners take on the Vols, and that will probably be on the national stage as well. As far as Oklahoma State goes, their biggest non-conference rival is going to be Oregon State. And it's an interesting and dangerous game, and luckily for them, it's going to be a home game to start off the season. For Texas, their biggest competition is going to be LSU, and that's a heavy hitter. Nothing else really needs to be said. And depending on how much LSU bounces back next year, good luck to Texas, is all that really can be said. Now for TCU, they're going to be going at Cal, and we'll get to relive the 2018 Cheez-It Bowl, and who doesn't love that? Cal, depending on how they pair up with their own Pac-12 rivals, might really need to get a win over TCU in order to be taken seriously if they can pull that off. So you might be able to call an upset for that one, depending on how things start to play out. For Texas Tech, they're going to take on Arizona, and there's nothing really pointing to Arizona being able to take Texas Tech out or pull an upset. But again, it's college football, so anything can happen. But that one is essentially also Texas Tech's to lose. As for West Virginia, they get both Florida State and Maryland outside of their conference. And those games are wrapped around a matchup with Eastern Kentucky. And in addition, that date with Florida State is also in Atlanta. So it'll be a little interesting to see how West Virginia handles those challenges. They might be the most challenged by non-conference games in the Big 12, but that's a good thing probably for them because of the way the Big 12 schedule is built, and they'll just be firing through that schedule. No August playing dates scheduled. There's just 1 week off in the 13-week season before the Big 12 championship. So they have a few extra games, West Virginia, to kind of make themselves look good and prove that they might be the team to beat, or at least one of the teams to beat in the Big 12, since outside of Oklahoma and Texas, it doesn't really seem like there's really a surefire third team to look at. So it really is a toss-up for most of the conference, even more so than the first three conferences that we discussed in this episode. And that brings us to another break, but when we come back, we're going to dive into the ACC and look at who, if anybody, can challenge for that top spot.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. And before we took a break, we talked about the Big 12 and what the next season could look like for the teams within that conference. And for this fifth segment, we're going to take a look at the ACC conference. And essentially what it comes down to here is who is going to threaten Clemson. Because Clemson is going to be one of the best three teams in college football, if not number one this season, period. So it's time for somebody else to kind of help make this conference a little more interesting. And at some point, that's probably going to have to be either Florida State or Miami, and they're going to have to wake up and start being Florida State and Miami that we used to know them to be and give the ACC some sizzle. But at the very least, these two teams should be a stronger overall competitor, and they're probably not going to combine to go for a 12-14 record again. So the rest of the league is going to have to be a lot stronger too in order to keep up And it looks like that might just be coming to pass this year, because 2019 looked like just the beginning for teams like Louisville under Scott Satterfield and North Carolina under Mac Brown also. But Virginia, on top of that, could also look like they could be consistently good. And there's a whole lot to get interested in when you check out Virginia Tech. And they've quietly been putting a decent-looking team together themselves. So Syracuse also should be a bit stronger after our last year's disappointment, just like Georgia Tech, who should be at least a little bit better after a year of total renovation, which a lot of teams in this conference needed, as you can tell. And there's no way that NC State is going to be just as bad as they were last year again. They went 4-8 over the season, and that looked like it was just a flop and maybe just a fluke of a season. But on the plus side, there are only two new head men, one at Boston College in Jeff Hafley, and one at FSU under Mike Norvell. And that's a plus because there is not a lot of coaching turnover, and especially in what's going to be a truncated season. That's going to be essentially what the difference maker is, and it's going to be so much more important to be on the same page with the rest of your team. On top of that, Wake Forest and Duke, their head coaches are still doing the most that they possibly can with the least amount of talent within the ACC and possibly the whole Power Five as a group. But when it comes down to it, what it really looks like is that Clemson is going to win the ACC championship again. And it's not going to be that difficult for them to do so. They really just have everything going for them. And in addition to just the personnel that they have, the track record that they have, the confidence, they also have the ease of schedule going for them. Outside of their own conference, they also don't have to play the SEC West or the Big Ten East. And it's going to be a huge plus, especially coming off of the last couple seasons where they kind of just breezed their way through to get right to the CFP. But it's not like the team was exposed on the big stages over the last 2 years, because they clinched a national title, of course, and had another appearance in the championship game when they were given a shot. But they more than deserve it because they've more than proven themselves and earned their stripes, no pun intended, under Dabo Swinney. Yet again, it's not their fault if the rest of the ACC plays at such a disappointing level, even though, when you look at other conferences and other teams that deserve to have just as much of a shot as Clemson do, they might get a little upset. But you don't necessarily pick who your opponents are, and you can just play who you're given. So Clemson gets a lot of hate for that. They get rated a little bit lowly because of that. But you really can't be mad at the end of the day. But with that being said, for all of the people that hate the fact that they get away with missing most of the top 25, this year, what's scheduled for November 7th, finally might be what some consider their karma, because they have to make the trip up north to South Bend to face Notre Dame. And even though Notre Dame hasn't been that formidable of a opponent, especially in the last couple of seasons, Notre Dame is still Notre Dame. And the team even gets a bit of a break for this because they get 2 weeks off to prepare, and Notre Dame has to play the week before. So they're still going to be probably the biggest opponent that Clemson sees during the regular season, and Clemson gets 2 weeks off to prepare for them. So this date with the Irish is a really big deal for Clemson, and it's going to figure in heavily when it comes to the selection committee deciding who gets into the playoffs, because Clemson is already the only team with a realistic shot to get straight through before even we've gotten close to the ball being kicked off, and any slip up in their record is going to heavily weigh against them, especially one that comes against Notre Dame. And any non-conference game matters the most, and that is probably the top non-conference opponent for any conference, for any major team. So for everyone else, it's about conference pride and just trying to up the stock for the conference as a whole and just overall help themselves look a little better, maybe challenge Clemson a little bit. But for Clemson, it's going to come down to whether or not they can get past Notre Dame. And essentially, it's going to come down to whether or not Notre Dame is going to show up looking like the Notre Dame of old and be the team that we are used to seeing hit the field in the blue and gold. And it should be a really good matchup between Clemson and Notre Dame if we're able to get it. And when you look at the rest of the slate that they have, outside the Irish, not many teams, especially when it comes to FBS teams, not even considering FCS teams, finished with winning records at the end of last season. Ultimately, it only comes down to Louisville, Virginia, and Wake Forest. Even though some teams put up quite a bit of a good fight in a lot of games last year, like North Carolina, Syracuse, even Louisville did themselves. But other than that, there's no real shot that most of those teams will end up being ranked in the preseason top 25 at the very least, and it'll take a very strong showing for them to earn their way into the top 25 throughout the season. If anybody, Virginia might have that chance, or Louisville might have that chance. But if you're ready to see somebody other than Clemson represent the ACC, or even represent the Atlantic in the ACC championship game, I wouldn't hold my breath too long for that. And that brings us to our final break. And when we come back, we're going to take a little bit of a look ahead at the season and the parts that we love the most, and hopefully we'll get to experience these, but we're going to pretend to go forward as if the season was going forward as planned. And we're going to look ahead at the best tailgates that we're looking forward to.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 5 sections, we talked conference by conference about what we should expect to see from each team and each conference as a whole once the season gets started. But with all of that being said, we are still not 100% sure of what we're going to watch once the fall hits. But there is one thing for sure that we already miss and we know that we're always looking forward to, and that is tailgates. And there are a lot of teams in college football that are known for their tailgates and throw great parties. But in this segment, we're going to take a look at the best tailgates in the country that we would be looking forward to getting right back to once the season gets underway. First one we're going to take a look at is Ole Miss, and the Rebels have the Grove. And that is a leafy 10 acres at their campus where fans congregate before campus. At their stadium, Vaught Hemingway, and it's completely unique because tailgating in Oxford is far from rustic. It is like college football's version of fine dining, and it is the classiest, most prestigious-looking tailgate you could ever hope to be invited to or experience. Because Ole Miss tailgaters take their menus so seriously. If you haven't noticed or haven't seen anything from a Rebels tailgate, they have things like refined food and cocktails, and those are ongoing tailgate traditions. But most importantly, what makes it feel like a game day is the Rebels team going through the Grove on game days. And that started back in 1985, and it's been tradition ever since, because that gives the fans a chance to toast their team as they make their way to the stadium, and it's become known as the Walk of Champions. So grab your cocktails, put your pinkies up, and cheers to a good game and some good times at Ole Miss with their fancy take on tailgating. Next on the list is not one school, but two schools combined, Florida and Georgia, who have come together to produce what has come to be known as the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. And it is known that way for a reason, because it started from the annual rivalry game, and this huge clash just spilled over into the pre-game festivities. And every year in Jacksonville, it's a fantastic, huge experience that brings together both Gators and Bulldogs fans from both sides of the border. And they have exactly what you think it is, a massive outdoor cocktail party. And it's nothing but good times. And if anybody ever gets the chance to have that experience, again, going forward, once fans are allowed to come to games, it's definitely one of the better tailgates to check out. Next on the list is the LSU Tigers, and for Louisiana, when it comes to food, there is no other tailgating scene in America that can match. Among football fans, LSU Tigers fans are considered some of the best cooks, if not the best cook, and just imagine every LSU tailgate with the energy that you already know, love, and come to expect from the game, and pair that with a smorgasbord large array of all of local New Orleans, Southern Louisiana specialties, anything that you can name, and it just sounds like maybe that you should even skip the game to stay at the party at some point. But if that doesn't make your mouth water, then I don't know what would. Next up is the Tennessee Volunteers, and in Knoxville, you could have fun on land and in water. Before the games at Neyland Stadium, some of those fans sailgate on boats in the Tennessee River, which, is essentially, tailgating on a sailboat. And that sounds like a really different take on a tailgate party. And obviously you can't do that anywhere, just anywhere. And that's what makes it such a special experience. And that sounds like a really fun way to kick off your Saturday afternoon. And for another Tiger take, this time is the Clemson Tigers. And one of the best parts of tailgating in South Carolina at Clemson is their Tiger Walk. And before every game, the players walk from the parking lot into Memorial Stadium, giving fans a chance to greet their team, just like Ole Miss. And it's a tradition that Clemson obviously is one team that's made famous, but you'll see a lot throughout the college football world. And it's just another chance to connect with the team and make that pride run even deeper. Right before you go and watch Clemson smack around whoever their ACC opponent is, or possibly even non-ACC opponent. It's just a good way to get in the mood to watch a good Clemson game. And staying within the state of South Carolina, the South Carolina Gamecocks make tailgating special because you can rent what's called a cockaboose, which is a vintage train car where you can eat and drink in luxury. And that sounds like a tradition that would challenge Ole Miss for who can be more fancy when trying to prepare for college football smackdown. And it sounds like nothing but good times. And if you haven't seen what this vintage train car looks like, you might want to Google it yourself and take a look at what you possibly could be tailgating in one day. Now for an Iowa Hawkeyes game, if you tailgate there, make sure you try a big-ass turkey leg, which is what they call it. The original BATL proprietor, whose name is Chuck Ford, is now retired, but you could still find this giant hunks of turkey in Iowa City at any Iowa Hawkeyes game, and it's become such a staple that you can even sometimes see it when you're watching pregame coverage on TV. And it's just become a symbol for Iowa football and even just in the state of Iowa. So go and try yourself a BATL and see what all the hype is about whenever you get a chance. And moving on to Penn State, over in State College during the weekend of a Nittany Lions game, it turns the entire town into a giant party, which shouldn't be a surprise for a town that's called State College for a reason. You can tell that it's probably very much based around the Nittany Lions, and that just brings fans out in droves, sometimes in RVs, to have fun outdoors before watching their team play and show their Nittany Lion pride. And staying within the Big Ten, that brings us to Wisconsin. And the Badgers sure know how to tailgate properly because Madison is one of the best college towns in America. And it's the perfect backdrop for a tailgate. And it has all of the best local cuisine that you could hope for in a tailgate. And that's beer and bratwurst. And Wisconsin figured out that that's really all you need to make a good tailgate. So as soon as we all get the chance to, that is also one classic, quintessential tailgate that needs to be checked out. And last but certainly not least is the Michigan Wolverines. And just judging by the size of the Michigan Stadium in the first place, it's the biggest sports venue in America, period. And obviously that means that the tailgating crowd on Saturdays is going to be absolutely enormous. Ann Arbor swells so much on the day of Wolverines games, and it's worth blending into the crowd if you ever get a chance to go see the most hyped stadium and the largest college football environment in America. In Michigan, it doesn't get any better than that. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.